It's not always easy to trust God. Our world is full of crime, disease, and unexpected deaths. Sometimes it's difficult to have faith that God is working in either our world or our lives because it's difficult to see what He's doing and hard to understand why He would allow certain things to happen. Especially if we've been hurt by people who claim to believe in God or even proclaim they were doing what God instructed them as they were hurting us. After all, if God is good and loves us, why doesn't everything work out for us? Shouldn't people who trust in Him have a better life than people who don't? Well, I want us to look at a story of someone who trusted God despite ending up in a bad situation over and over. His name was Joseph. God had given Joseph 2 dreams that his 11 brothers would bow down to him. As you can imagine, when he told his brothers about his dreams, they weren't thrilled about it. They eventually captured Joseph and sold him into slavery. Joseph had trusted in the dreams God gave him, and he ended up hated by his family and becoming the lowest of lows in society. Thankfully, the man who purchased Joseph was a high-ranking official of Egypt named Potiphar, who was able to give Joseph a good life. Joseph worked hard for his master and was promoted to head of Potiphar's estate. However, Potiphar's wife took an interest in Joseph and tried to seduce him. Joseph held true to the values of his faith and continued to refuse her advances, even one time literally running away from her. Upset by this, she lied to her husband that Joseph had tried to rape her, and Potiphar had Joseph thrown into prison. Joseph had trusted God's values, and he ended up in a worse situation again. Years later, the Pharaoh of Egypt was troubled by a dream he had, and he heard that in the prison there was a man who was able to interpret dreams. This man was Joseph, who, through more of his diligence, had become the warden's right-hand man and received from God the interpretation for a man's dream, who now worked for Pharaoh. Joseph was called by Pharaoh to interpret his dream, which was a warning that 7 years of famine was on the way. Pharaoh then appointed Joseph to be his right-hand man, and Joseph made the preparations for the famine. He believed that God had not given up on him yet, and rose to the second highest position in Egypt. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt for the food that Joseph had saved. Not recognizing who Joseph was, they bowed to him as the right hand of Pharaoh. The dreams Joseph received from the God he'd continued to trust in through all of the ups and downs in his life had come true. There are 2 things I want to point out in this story about trusting God. The first is that Joseph never waited for God to fix his situation for him. When he was sold into slavery and thrown in prison, we can see that it was through his own hard work and diligence that he rose to higher positions. He didn't sit around blaming God for his troubles, and didn't demand that he deserved better because of his faithfulness. He instead took his life into his own hands and gave every situation his best by following the values he had learned through his faith in God. Doing so was not abandoning God or refusing to trust Him. It was instead choosing to walk out a lifestyle he knew would be pleasing to God. The second thing I want to point out from this example is that God's promise to Joseph was fulfilled. God never broke His promise that his family would bow down to him. Despite all of the hardships Joseph went through, it was all necessary for him to end up in a position where God could use him in His plan to save all the people in and around Egypt during the famine. God had the end goal in mind, and Joseph just needed to do his part in trusting God throughout that time leading up to it. You see, without God's promise at the start of Joseph's life, this would only be a story of someone going through ups and downs in their life. Yet, because of the dreams God gave Joseph, as well as the ability for Joseph to be able to interpret dreams which he received from God, we can see that this story is instead about God making and keeping His promise to Joseph, and Joseph's ability to trust God through every tough situation he went through. We can trust in God because He always keeps His promises. And it's on us to do the work and live the life that He has called us to during the time in between. If you'd like to talk to me more about this or have a question you'd like me to address, you can contact me through the Sermon in the Pocket Facebook page or email me at sermoninthepocket@gmail.com. Also, if you like what I'm doing and want to support this podcast, you can do so through the Sermon in the Pocket Patreon page. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and have a wonderful day.